Caring for Caregivers Mental Health Program webinar. And as most of you know, Mickey's Miracles is primarily a pediatric epilepsy organization. We advocate for families to get children suspected of having epilepsy to a level 4 epilepsy center urgently for diagnosis and treatment, and really increasing awareness about the medical emergency that pediatric epilepsy is and its capacity to create havoc in the developing brain to the point of impacting a child's brain to have permanent brain damage. And we've even seen fatalities from pediatric epilepsy, whether it's SUDEP and or complications from the seizures or other underlying ailments. You know, it happens far too often. So that remains the focus of our work. But we also saw that as we were working with families, there was a very big need to have conversations regarding caregiver mental health. You know, caregiving for a child with a medically complex issue. Well, caregiving just generally is challenging and can lead to exhaustion, stress, and all those other, things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And caregiving for a child with medically complex issues when their future might be uncertain, their medical condition might change from day to day, their level of support that they need might change from day to day. We found that there was an acute need to really address the issue of caregiver mental health. And that's why we created the Caring for Caregivers Mental Health Program. And we're so fortunate that Norellis and Jazz stepped up. They saw the need, they saw the space in the caregiver world for these types of conversations. And we're so grateful for them, for their support, and so grateful for our medical advisory board, in particular, Dr. Janelle Wagner, for her shaping of this program, her shaping of the content, and really her wisdom. And we've had so many great presenters and facilitators, and today is no different. We've heard from Eileen before, Eileen Devine. I'll let her, share her background a little bit more than me, but I was impressed immediately with her approach to like getting underneath what's actually happening in the brain, not just for, the children, but for the parents that are responsible for the children. And, your neurological approach and I forget what it is exactly. Is it brain first is how you call it, right? Brain first approach.
Exactly. Yep.
Was so unique to me, and that's how I discovered, Eileen, and because then I dove into her work and some of the stuff she posted, and then I thought, wow, this is a perspective that is sorely needed for families. And one of the exciting things about this program is that it's not just for caregivers of children experiencing epilepsy, but it's open for all parents who experience caregiving for children of all medically complex varieties. So whether it's autism or something that can be challenging from a medical standpoint outside of epilepsy, outside of even neurology, right? Autism, epilepsy, there's a bunch of neurological stuff that is a common thread. But even outside of neurological based illnesses or conditions. So we created this program for the folks at home, for the folks who really, from our experience, needed to hear you're not alone. For the folks who, from our experience, needed to hear, hey, it's okay that it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
And it's okay to grieve what you thought might have happened,
mm-hmm.
or what future your child might have had. It's okay to not be okay sometimes with how difficult this is and all the different challenges that come with caring for a child with medically complex issues. So Eileen comes to us, very highly regarded. She has an outstanding body of work, and we'll tell you as the program goes on where you can find her. Aside of this, she has her own practice, which I think is worth looking at for parents who are looking for additional support beyond what we can do at Mickey's Miracles. But for today, Eileen, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to having another robust conversation with you and learning from you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm glad to be back. I'm going to get my slides up here. So yeah, I am a therapist. I live in Portland, Oregon, and I work with parents internationally, and they all have kids with brain-based differences of some kind. And I came to this work because my daughter, Maya, who is now 14, she has a very serious brain-based condition. She has fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. We adopted her at birth. And in trying to figure out how the heck to parent her in a way that actually helped her and didn't make her symptoms worse, once I felt like I figured that out for myself, I wanted to be able to share that with other parents, because I didn't want them to have to experience the same level of frustration, chronic frustration that I did. So that's how I came to this work. And a lot of what I teach them in my Brain First Parenting program is seeing their child through a brain-based lens. We know that we know that behaviors and the brain are always connected. And it helps, I think, some parents settle into this idea to know that everything that I'm about to share is supported by neuroscience research, that brain and behaviors can never be separated. I think about it as behaviors living in the brain. And so when we are considering one thing, which is usually our child's challenging, aggravating, relentless behavior, we must consider the brain. We have to be curious about what this has to do with their brain. And for your listeners' kids, for my child, it's about, what does this mean about their brain working differently? So it really is this foundational understanding about the brain and the behaviors and seeing our child through that lens. This neurobehavioral model, which is the foundation of the Brain First Parenting that I teach parents, it's an individualized approach. So my guess is that many parents listening have experienced lots of providers giving them lots of advice, really helpful to some kids, suggestions that don't work for their child. And that's because their child's brain works uniquely. And it even works uniquely in comparison to another child with that same diagnosis of that same age, right? Different parts of the brain can be impacted in different ways. And so looking at your child through a brain-based lens, it may feel like a steep learning curve at first, but that's because you're looking at it unique to your child, not a one size fits all. The end result of that is that hard work pays off. Then you know so much about your child that maybe you didn't know before. You have now information about them that can really help them settle and be less symptomatic, meaning less challenging behavioral symptoms. So when we see that our child's brain differences have everything to do with their challenging behaviors, that those behaviors are symptoms, it really does change everything. It provides us with understanding and clarity, like, oh my gosh, that's why they're always doing this thing that is so hard on me, or so, like I said, relentless, right? Whatever behavior it might be. It provides us with clarity on how we can help them settle in their environment. It reduces our frustration. It reduces our child's frustration. They're better understood, and it improves the outcomes with them. So we know that there's lots of different reasons that a brain can be impacted. There's over 40,000 documented reasons in research, which every time I think about that, I think it's amazing that any of us are what society would consider neurotypical, right? Here's just some of the few that I see with many of the parents that I support. All of these reasons, all of these events, or what you might hear is like insults to the brain, they result in that brain changing in function and structure, which means that individual has a lot of difficulty with seemingly easy cognitive tasks. And behaviors are usually the only symptom, right? Sometimes we have kids, like if you spent time with my child, my 14-year-old, you would understand pretty quickly that there was something different about her. But many kids look neurotypical, or they do for a short amount of time, and except for these behavioral symptoms, which can make it, of course, confusing. Here's just a very small snapshot in what I'm talking about with these lagging cognitive skills, things that society expects people to be able to do because society sees all people through a neurotypical lens, right? That they have control of their behaviors, that they can do these things like think fast and listen fast, or multitask, task, follow two-step directions at a time, those sorts of things, inhibit their impulses, right? We know that when a brain has been changed for any of those reasons that I listed on that slide, that there are going to be differences in those cognitive skills. So for example, just taking one of these, we know that kids around the age of 5 typically can start to inhibit their impulses. But what if you have a child who is neurodiverse, and even at the ages of 12, 13, 14, they still have the impulsivity of a toddler? What does that look like behaviorally? What does it mean for their frustration tolerance? How do they get along with their peers? Right? All of those sorts of things, which when not understood through a brain-based lens, it looks like this child is just choosing to misbehave, choosing to not listen, choosing to ruin everything, choosing to not be kind, when that's just simply not the case. That's a symptom of the environment not understanding, oh, they can't do this. They would do better if they could. When they're misunderstood, so they're in an environment where they're expected to act their age, or they're expected to sit still, they're expected to inhibit their impulses, they're expected to, be able to follow along with what the teacher's saying and keep up with the verbal processing. All these really common lagging skills are not recognized. They become frustrated, just like you and I would. And so when that happens, they experience behavioral symptoms like overwhelm, anxiety, lashing out, rage. They're out of their window of tolerance when that happens. So this Dr. Ross Greene, he wrote the book Explosive Child, lots of other books too, they're all excellent. He has this quote that I think describes that perfectly. Children exhibit challenging behavior when the demands being placed upon them outstrip the skills they have to respond adaptively to those demands. The same can be said of all human beings. So if we were in an environment where we were absolutely trying our best, we didn't have the skills to do the thing that was expected of us, and we said, can't do it, I'm working as hard as I can, and someone said, oh, now you're just being lazy, or you just don't care, you should be grateful to even be here, and started taking things away from us that mattered to us, or started shaming us and punishing us, isolating us from other people, we'd probably have some behavioral symptoms when that happened. The same thing happens for our kids. It just happens to them, some kids, every day, all day, until they are understood differently. So this is the simple, not so simple equation, right? So why do we see challenging behavioral symptoms in kids who have brain-based differences of some kind? Because they have lagging skills. That's part of their difference or their disability. They are in environments where that's not recognized. So expectations are set for them that they just can't meet. They're basically set up for failure. And that results in those challenging symptoms, right? The overwhelm, the frustration, the anxiety, the running away, right? Fight or flight, all of those things.
Yeah.
So what can we do about it? Because I'm like making this all sound so neat and simple, right? This is my last slide. It's going to end with, this is what we do about it. And you'll be left with going, there's so much more. Accommodations are the treatment and the path towards less challenging behavior. So if you think about anyone else in our society with a physical disability, we absolutely provide them with accommodations. It's not even a question. So the same should be true for these kids who have brain-based differences. Their brain, a physical part of our body, has been changed in some way. They need accommodations. The tricky part, which I don't need to tell the parents listening this, is that we see behaviors in our society through a behavioral lens, that they're willful, intentional, defiant. So it takes time for us to shift our own lens, understanding like, oh, they would do better if they could. This is about their level of frustration. What do I need to support them more in? What expectations do I need to adjust? Those are all accommodations, right? Getting every environment that your child is in on board with that, it can be a challenge, right? But that really is the path towards treatment and intervention. It's not giving in. It's not letting your child get away with something. It's actually being a very compassionate, caring, attentive parent to be able to do that for your child who truly needs accommodations to be successful. And then I know you mentioned earlier where folks can find other free resources. this was probably the most condensed version I've ever done
Mhm.
of what it means to see a child through a brain-based lens. So I want to let folks know there's lots more layers of complexity to it, of course, but if it's piqued your interest, there's lots of blog posts and free resources on my website where you can dive a lot deeper into it. So that's
Thank
it.
you, Eileen.
Yeah.
I have
You want me
a few
to
questions.
sharing my screen?
Surprisingly, yeah, you can stop sharing your screen. So,
Okay.
of course, I have a few questions.
Yeah, of course. Great.
So how does that impact? So I'm a parent and I understand, my child is doing X, Y, or Z because he or she is neurotypical, right? How does that impact my ability to regulate my role as a caregiver and my mindset and my emotional response to things that might otherwise provide a different emotional response or justify a different emotional response?
Yep. There's a few ways that I would answer that. So and I think I've talked about this here before. I talk about these two sides of the coin. One side of the coin is what we've talked about, understanding how your child's brain works differently. The other side is all about the parent experience. And one of the things you're touching on is many of the parents that I work with, they start to understand this foundational model of the brain behavior connection, what we just talked about. And they're like, oh, that makes sense. I get it. I want to do that for my child. I believe that about my child. I want to learn how to develop accommodations. And where they get stuck is the implementation of it, because we're still human. Those behaviors, those challenging behavioral symptoms are still going to trigger us. They will still cause a reaction in us because we're human. And so the other piece of the work, maybe even the harder piece of the work, honestly, is to constantly practice taking a step back, remaining curious, remaining in that space of non-judgmental curiosity, seeing the behaviors as symptoms, trying to slow down that visceral reaction that we have to behaviors so that we can regulate ourselves and move forward with empathy and understanding versus punishment, reactivity, consequences, shaming, just exerting our power and control in any way we can. Those are two really different paths. I promise you that this path over here, leading with empathy and curiosity, you're going to end up in a much better place. But don't beat yourself up if it feels clunky and it feels challenging to get on that path consistently. That's part of the work, right? So you're no different than anyone else.
So two things. One is I love that don't beat yourself up. And I think that extends to even when you are out of character necessarily and you don't have perfect empathy or perfect understanding, or you don't do exactly the right thing that you would do if you were regulated. And the second part is, what does that mean to be regulated? How do you regulate yourself so that you can be in a mindset to be able to look at things objectively and to be able to look at behaviors through that brain-based lens, instead of getting frustrated because you're not getting neurotypical behavior or response and or whatever.
Yeah. Yep. So the first part of that answer is that most of what you do to stay regulated in the moment happens outside the moment. So you have to do the work outside of the moment to increase your resilience, stabilize your nervous system so that you go into those challenging moments on more solid ground. And so it doesn't have to be, hours a day. I know parents do not have that. It can be moments that evening, reflecting on what happened, what you hope to do differently, checking in with yourself and how did you feel, instead of like burying it, ignoring it, just soldiering on, right? Really easing into and checking in with how you're doing. All of that will provide you with more resilience in the moment. Now, in the moment, to stay regulated, and this is again coming up with a plan for yourself, that happens outside of the moment too. So that in the moment, you don't have to think as hard. When we are dysregulated, same for our kids. When our kids are dysregulated, their thinking brain is offline. We're asking them, sit down, be quiet, I want to talk to you. And they're like, oh, can't even hear what you're saying, right? Because they're so dysregulated. Same is true for us. So in the moment, when you're starting to feel agitated or you're feeling that visceral reaction, your thinking brain is going offline. You want to be able to have a plan in your back pocket that helps you stay regulated as much as possible. So things like, is it breath work, right? That you've practiced and you can do? Is it bringing to mind a person or a place who regulates you, right? That can keep you grounded. Is it repeating a mantra to yourself, right? To help you stay in the present moment and stay regulated. It's different for each person, and that's fine. That's great. It's just knowing what it is for you and not trying to make it up in the moment. That just won't be successful. The other piece about that is when you experience it, you're in a challenging episode with your child, much of our energy tends to be, how do I get them to stop this behavior? How do I de-escalate things in this moment? And we need to talk about that. That's important. But it's such a better use of your energy to do work outside of the moment in terms of how to support your child too. So about yourself, but also your child, like there's always patterns. So like, why do they blow up every morning at this time? Why can't I get them out the door in time? Why do I, these repeated frustrations that accumulate? Well, why is that? What does that have to do with how their brain works differently? What accommodation do they need to more smoothly get through that stuck point that you're experiencing every single day, right? So it's definitely about you. It's definitely about how does it connect to your child's brain working differently, and what accommodations can you put in place when this inevitably comes up again, right?
Yeah.
There's very little that's random. It may feel like that, right? It just comes out of nowhere. But when you start really looking for the patterns, they're there.
So to kind of unpack that just a little bit, to kind of approach this from a formulaic perspective, one is prepare, right? And that can look like all kinds of things, but we talked about these things before: connect to community, right? Ask for support, movement, nutrition, sleep, time for yourself. And that looks like something different for everyone.
Yep.
But really, those are some of the kind of central tenets of, self-care, quote unquote. And I know we don't like to use self-care because parents get triggered by it.
Resilience
I
building.
care for myself when I have to care for other things and nobody cares about me. And I mean, we've approached that before, but so one is prepare for the moment, right? Another is, like put it in proper perspective, meaning your child isn't acting out because he or she wants to. Your child is acting out because there's something going on neurologically.
Yeah.
That's right.
One of the ways that I encourage parents to see challenging behaviors, and again, this is like an instant reframe that parents can do that can help them stay regulated, is to see challenging behaviors as your child in pain and distress, right? Instead of they're doing something to me on purpose, like, oh my goodness, they're in pain and distress. Like that just instantly softens us, right? Or like one thing that I think about with my daughter is, wow, this is her fragile nervous system showing itself to me. Like, oh, she's so fragile. Instead of, she won't calm down, she won't stop, she won't, it's like, oh, she can't. Her nervous system is so fragile. She needs my support. She needs me. It's it can be such a powerful reframe in those moments. And again, leave us in a more regulated state so we can actually then do something about it instead of escalate things, right? I have a 15-year-old who is what society would consider neurotypical. My daughter's 14. So this kind of side-by-side parenting their whole life, and things I was doing for him that have worked really well so far. Would just escalate her. And I was like, why is that? It's not a bad parenting technique. It just doesn't work for her, right? So it's not that what these parents are doing is like so bad, or, that there's shame involved or blame. It's like, yeah, that just isn't going to work for your child whose brain works so differently, right? So let's figure out what you can do as a parent to help them settle in a way that, some parents come to me and they're like, I just don't even think it's possible. And so when you start to see the glimmers of hope, like, oh my gosh, okay, yeah, things are getting better. Like, oh, I wouldn't do this work if that didn't happen. So,
Yeah. So I think so. I like to be alliterative because I think I'm cute that way. But so the first one would be like, prepare, practice, right? The second, put in its proper perspective, and the third is like
mhm,
prepare for the triggers. You've said, hey,
mhm,
like this is, or plan for the triggers. Maybe, this is a behavior that I see every night before bed, or every
mhm,
day after school, or when I'm asking him or her to do an activity they don't want to do, or when
mhm,
they think I'm punishing them when I'm trying to, whatever, right? So kind of
mhm.
they're all different because
That's
there's
right.
some individualized approaches, and it'd be impossible to predict all the triggers, but parents get to know their kids and get to see that. So maybe even documenting the disruptions
Oh,
or
definitely. Definitely.
circumstances. What were the
Mhm,
circumstances? Who was present? What time? What
mhm,
was the topic?
mhm,
What was their
mhm.
responsiveness on 1 to 10? Like really objective type stuff to start to identify patterns and to
Yes.
prepare for them.
Yeah. There's at the link that I shared about the free resources, the first one on that slide, there is a 12-day journal that I created for parents to help them get started with just that. Like, how do I start to carve out just a few minutes a day to reflect on what's happened? How do I start to document patterns of what's happened, right? So if that if that sounds helpful to anyone, I hope you take advantage of it. It's you don't have to spend hours a night. In fact, I would discourage you from doing that. You already have enough of your time doing other things, but even just setting your timer for 5 minutes and doing what you can in 5 minutes. Most nights, not even every night. We're not aiming for perfection, just some
Yeah.
progress. But yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
progress
All of
and
those points
preparation
that you
over
made.
perfection for sure.
Yeah, all of those
What
points that you made,
with
I
with
would
parents, I
agree.
wonder, and I know this is a different topic, and we're going to do a different, bigger program on this, considering it's summer and structures of schedules are different, support for parents are
Mhm.
different, but heading into the summer, if you can give parents at home just one piece of
Mm,
advice, on how to stay regulated as best as
mhm,
possible and how to help their children stay regulated as best as possible.
mhm.
What would be that nugget? What would be that tweetable kind of moment
Structure.
that yeah. Yeah, so
I
I
mean,
love that.
it sounds so simple, but we know that all kids thrive on structure, but it is truly disorienting and dysregulating for most kids with brain-based differences not to have structure. And part of that is because one really classic lagging skill is not being able to anticipate what's coming next. It causes them anxiety and overwhelm, and you could see a lot of escalation behaviors just from that. That's just one reason why. But it also provides parents with a lot of relief. I know that the upfront work is what discourages a lot of people from doing it. I totally get that. But I promise you it will be worth your while, because then your child will be more settled. Maybe there's like a visual showing of the schedule that they can look at, but also making part of that schedule some time where you get a breath of literally fresh air, ideally. And I know that not everybody has another parent that is participating in the parenting. I know that not everybody has the, village of people around them that we would hope for. I just would encourage you to still think about, is there a half hour of time where your kids can watch a show that you're okay with and you go into your room and just have that time, and they know, like, they can anticipate that too. One of the things that parents also talk about with a summer schedule is like, well, I don't want to be boxed in. If I tell my child something's going to happen and then we just change plans because of whatever, then that causes dysregulation. And so if that's the case, you might want to have structure, but not box yourself in with the details. So for example, having the morning, like 2 hours of outside time, the afternoon be 2 hours of arts and crafts or inside games or whatever. The afternoon being 2 hours of, I don't know, but having more broad categories instead of we're going to go swimming and then we're going to go to the park and then we're going to, so if those details change, your child can ease into that change maybe a little more easily. So that really would be my very first suggestion.
Yeah, structure. I love that. Christy wrote an article, and the premise of the article was, planning and consistency over perfection, because things are going to get screwed up, but predictability is a big part of structure, right? Planning to be predictable is a big part of structure. And then, if there's a deviation, preparing for it, right? And know that there could be some deregulation, quote unquote, for the parents or parent and the child. And that goes back to kind of understanding what the triggers are, right? So if I said we're going to do X and X doesn't happen when it was supposed to happen, there's a potential there for stress, both on the parent and of course the child, for reacting to, what he or she thought was going to happen that didn't.
That's right. They can't go with the flow. They can't just shift and kind of move with those changes as easily.
Yeah,
as
that chart that you showed was really helpful. The neurotypical kind of response and behaviors versus the non-neurotypical. So I will share that on our social media just for folks to see, because I think it just makes it, obviously there's a bunch of additional ones in both categories, but those are big ones, that I think start to kind of identify, that brain first approach that you're talking about. Hey, like, wait a minute, like, my child doesn't do these things like a neurotypical child would. So I get to adapt, and I get to look at it differently, and I get to have empathy, and I get to lead with my heart instead of my head, and regulate myself so I can be regulated for them so that they can regulate themselves. So as always, thank you, Eileen, for sharing.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
I still encourage everyone at home who hasn't visited Eileen's website to visit her website. So many great resources, so many great articles, great videos, and she really, I think, is the standard bearer for parents and who really are challenged by, some of these things that most parents are challenged by, but in particular made more acute by a medically complex child and caring for him or her. So thank you, obviously, on behalf of our board, on behalf of Christy Grease, our CEO and visionary founder, and the Medical Advisory Board, and the families we get to serve, and we get to put our arms around every season of that journey, including facilitating community around mental health and providing connection around mental health. We give you our gratitude and our thanks.
No, thanks for having me. Love
you.